actually, I have two questions. So the first one was when you were talking about Anna Shell work on camouflage.
Yeah.
That what she describes as people trying to escape detection, trying also to behave in ways that are based on their understanding of how the observer would try to detect them.
Yes.
So I thought that the analogy would be with your work on spam about the Bayesian filters, trying to look at new forms of spam to kind of tune themselves. But the real question, so to go back, so there is, I was thinking also about forensics, which is different from what you're talking about, because what you're talking about are people who are not only alive but moving.
Yeah.
Instead, forensics mostly is about dead, dead bodies that don't move. Right?
Yeah.
But one thing that is really interesting is that one of the key factor in forensics of dead body is dust.
Yes.
So in a sense, dust seems to be the other end of the spectrum that you're talking about. That is, you're talking about certain kind of movements and behaviors that are coded either to escape detection based on the assumption that the observer would have about the way you would move and so on. And at the extreme end where there is no more movement, right?
Yeah.
Then the detection of what may have happened tends to have to do with the disruption of dust patterns.
Yes. Yeah.
So dust that seems to be as kind of basically pure, the material equivalent of noise, right?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
anyway, it's just rambling. but there is everything I know about dust and forensics is Ian Burney article in Representation on how dust became because with dust there is no way you can cover your truck if you disrupt dust you cannot patch it out. In a sense it's like it's almost like it's physically its physical properties prevent any cover-up.
Yes. Well, I think is actually very salient too, because one of the things about obfuscation, one of the sort of properties of it that I find most interesting is that it's something that often emerges. We can see it in a lot of different contexts where something has happened that in one way or another it can't be covered up, it can't be masked, it can't be conventionally hidden. It's often a strategy of last resort, right? It's something that you do when, precisely to stay with this dust idea, when you've left your footprints in it, you can't send someone back to analyze the stochastic properties of how dust is deposited with tweezers, So instead you just mess up the whole floor. You try to disguise where
you pour more dirt on top of it.
Yes, yeah, or you have many footprints going in many different directions. And we have the example actually of the Guatemalan example of after this particular bishop was murdered, the Guatemalan secret police manufactured evidence not of a false trail to disguise the actual murder by the secret police, but of many false trails, with the assumption that no one would believe whatever evidence was produced, but if they produced enough of it, you couldn't necessarily figure out which one was the particular lie.
Because there would be so many options.
Exactly. The proliferation of different choices.
The ways that one's own obfuscation might make it harder for others to associate any particular digital trail with that other person.
Yeah.
So that could, of course, make it harder for. The obvious concern would be that it would make it harder for the police to say this was the person who did this act.
Yeah.
Right. So how do you feel? How do you respond to that concern, which is if we mess up digital trails and we can't say this person actually searched for how to make a bomb or whatever it is, then it's harder for the police and prosecutors to actually prove, to use this as evidence, as useful evidence towards showing that that person was the actual guilty party?
That's an excellent question. I think it's to answer that properly, though, we have to be able to assess the trade-offs in a way that I think is not particular to obfuscation, but is shared a lot by things like the adoption of strong encryption. So we've actually seen in just the last few days, since the Paris attacks, the revival of the argument around the idea that strong encryption technology, for which there are no known government backdoors, are a liability and an aid to terrorism. The ex-head of the CIA said this. We've had a lot of this conversation, especially in Europe. We've had a lot of this conversation going on again. And to that, I think the question has to be asked, so if I may draw kind of a parallel, there's a lot of conversation in the digital cash world about enabling crime, right? That the creating anonymous digital currencies is going to be a huge boost to crime. But there's already a fantastic way to deal with money if you're a criminal, which is bags of cash, which is actually just moving cash around. And in a similar way, I would want to have a deeper discussion about how much utility we actually get for law enforcement out of things like analyzing search results, or looking at that kind of traffic versus human intelligence, for instance. We've seen, I think, very mixed results about many of the NSA's claims about what it's actually been able to prevent versus what has been produced by, tasked human agents working in the field.
Connecting it to these events this week in Paris, for example, it does seem that the surveillance mesh had found these people in some way or another. Right? So the question was how it interpreted that data and responded to that information. So, in some sense, is it a failure of surveillance or of kind of human intelligence along the way? It's hard to know exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, and the nature of these failures is often much more complex and systematic than it is sort of a single clear point. And it's something that I'm dubious about. The demands for total information awareness or total information oversight, not necessarily even out of inherent suspicion of the state or whatever, but simply because of the fact that to actually act on these things is often a very complex bureaucratic process, and it's very tempting to imagine a sort of perfect panoptical view. I think of for example, a canonical book in the sort of literature of hacking, which is the Shockwave Library, this famous sci-fi novel that became a huge inspiration to a lot of early hackers, which is predicated on the idea that when this hacker at the end of the book writes the super worm that commandeers the dystopian government apparatus and reveals everything that's revealed is clear, convenient malfeasance that's easy to act on. This worm spits out this data in this beautifully packaged form where it's here's proof that the government is doing X, Y, and Z, and then people can sort of take action when in fact to connect the dots on suspicious activity, there's a really tricky tightrope to walk around that.
They're creating their own obfuscation by the amount of type of information they're actually putting in, where they can't read it anymore in that respect to fill out. I mean, they did have a need for this. They did have intelligence that's told them, certain people were tied in with other organizations that didn't follow it up. So one would think that sometimes these information intelligence that isn't obfuscated might actually lead to some places. It might not, too. So they make some mistakes along the way.
I love the idea that they are, in fact, they're adding to the pay stuff in some sense.
Right.
Yes, yeah.
And so the obfuscation.
Or dust.
Yes.
Either adding their own chaff by excessive, unjustified.
Doing their own version of it.
But it must help in the forensics, though, because then they have the information. Once they've identified the people, piece together.
Yeah.
The question is, with that information, do they then see patterns of other things or not?
Yeah. Well, and it's also to say that, just on a very practical level, it's one thing to be able to, track someone's movements or to see that they are, sending or receiving packages or they are traveling in places that allow you to, link them up with people who are, in Syria or Iran or wherever. But it's quite another to say we need access to all of WhatsApp so that WhatsApp has more message volume than I'm trying to remember off the top of my head how many messages it handles internally. It's in the trillions. So to like get that, just like
and
moving
as
it
you
into
pointed out, now that Daesh and ISIS, just because they're attacks, everybody's going to use these terms.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at the the times that these terms are going to be used, it's absolutely going to obfuscate anybody who's using it for any other particular reason. So the more spectacular the event is, the more likely it's all over the place all the time.
But yeah, I think there's a great deal of bureaucratic pressure to appear to be doing something, and that doing something often takes the form of, well, we need access to whatever secret mechanisms they were using to communicate. But you just think of the case of like the struggle with the mafia in the United States. A lot of the time, these secret mechanisms they were using to communicate were phones, and they were still able to very effectively establish large-scale
in some sense, you almost wonder. So you talk in one of your papers about the theater of surveillance.
Yeah.
And so you talk about this kind of the affect of information dominance. And so, the kind of, but here, the interesting thing is every time there's a failure, the intelligence community always points to these were the ways that we were restricted from being able to actually help.
Yeah.
It wasn't our failure. The failure was in those who prevented us from helping you.
Yeah. Yes.
So in some sense, it's a very clever move because you need constraints then because you're never at fault.
Yeah.
Okay. You need someone to say you can't do that because then you can always say because I couldn't do that. I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
So there's never any sense of responsibility that even with the incredible powers that they have, right? They didn't actually identify the perpetrator who was going to commit this crime. So you almost wonder whether or not at some point you should license everything and then pull it together. So but I'm just saying as a kind of ludicrous proposal, but it almost leads to that logic. The logic is license us to everything. Only then can we actually be held to account for any failure.
Yeah. No, and I think there's an implicit problem here, which is I think we can see this wonderful book, Normal Accidents. That's right, like a study of like risk and accidents in large-scale institutions, especially nuclear power plants. And one of the key points of normal accidents is that, which is a wonderful kind of very close empirical analysis. So this is solidly based in practice. Is that when these systems get new features, new technologies, new mechanisms, new practices that make them safer, what instead happens is that if the machine is now registered to run longer safely, you run it longer between checks. If you know that you have like a better tolerance for being able to deal with some kind of risk, you run it closer to the edge of that tolerance. If the workers are certified to work longer hours without making mistakes, you work them longer. Like all of the ways in which these things are designed to enable a particular amount, a particular quantity of safety becomes something that quickly resets the baseline of acceptable risk. And in a similar way, I think, or in a somewhat analogous way, this model this stance that, well, we screwed up last time because we didn't have adequate access to the information, which often does not turn out to be true necessarily, leads to an attempt to blame others, when in fact we produce, I think, precisely a counterproductive action. Without significantly better analysis of the existing data, I can't imagine adding a huge new volume of communications in languages for which they don't necessarily have speakers or translators, with data sets that they don't necessarily have good analytics for dealing with. I always love those scenes in like the Jason Bourne movies when they're trying to find Bourne, and the team always like rushes in, and they're always like, "All right, I want every surveillance camera feed of every airport in the Western Hemisphere. I want all hotel check-in records." And it's like, great, you guys are going to be working on this for years. Like, we got until 2019 to sort through all of that stuff. And there's always a sense that if you have good data as this kind of magic object, then presumably the analysis will take care of itself.
Right.
In fact, that's...
They don't think of it as a flood.
Yes.
They think that it's a funnel.
Yes. Yeah. And you'll get like the telling point.
Mari, I'm going to move you here because I think have to go
So, so Job.
yes, Job. Then I move you here. Sorry.
I just want to continue the question had in the class.
Yeah.
I want to know about the open source. I have some actually there are anonymous people, so maybe we cannot find someone. But on the other hand, I want to know, open source is different from the initial one, from the original one. There is more and more sponsors from IBM, from Intel, from businessmen. So I want to know whether there is something changed, or whether open source will be changed by the sponsorship from the internet, from the businessman.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't have any sponsor since Stallman starts this years.
Yeah.
So the relationship of business and open source will it change the nature of open source?
That's a fantastic question. No. It's a very good question, and it's one that also I think links into what we've been talking about so far, which is that. So we can sort of have this inherent assumption, right, that open source is trustworthy. This was always the great vision. This was Eric Raymond's fantastic piece, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, this legendary manifesto about open source software, in which one of the claims is, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shot. That if you have enough people looking at the code of the software, you can fix almost anything.
Yes.
And that it will be more secure because it is available for public review. And that is true in theory, in the same way that it is true in theory that providing more data to law enforcement will enable them to spot perpetrators better. But in practice, the labor and the overhead and the culture around doing code review is far more complex and is not something that you can necessarily rely on to provide security and privacy, as we've seen repeatedly with these really sort of heartbreaking revelations around things like the Heartbleed bug, like these huge bugs in existing widely used open source code. We had another problem with Tails recently, precisely not out of any malice, not out of anyone planting anything, but simply because the overhead, the social overhead of managing the community to actually go through everything systematically and do the boring work of looking for these things is very difficult to in fact provide. And so again, there is a very vivid model of how the technology is to work that doesn't have a similar social apparatus in place to help sort of put it into practice. So this is an area where the relationship with business kind of breaks down, because part of the assumption with business is you contribute to open source code, you push it out into the community, they make it better, and everyone wins. You get this kind of constant. But in fact, often it's the people who are salaried who are the only ones who are actually able to like sort of push it much, because they're the people who can like devote full-time, highly skilled employee labor to something like this. So it's a similar case where I think there is like a mismatch between, and this is part of what the talk was hoping to get at, a mismatch between our mental model of how this works, our human sense of how it should work, with how it actually functions in practice as a technology.
So it's for a value crisis. So in theory, the whole community can work, but for a specific program, maybe it has to work. It does make sense. It has to stay or it can take so long time.
Yes.
So why the company get into open source? There is apparent obviously they did some patents from open source, but so do you think they will change the open source community? So the company will ask them to do this, to that kind of things, but maybe the open source community won't follow his strategy. To think there will be some conflicts.
Yeah, I mean there already are to some degree. I mean, and there's been ongoing problems with the fact that the open source world it's very hard to get people to work on things that aren't kind of glamorous. I mean, in a sort of hacker programmer sense, like where server software and browsers and stuff are really interesting, and security and secure chat systems are really interesting. But what's not interesting is customer relations management. Like huge parts of business structure which are very hard to open source because no one wants to write a tedious project like that. And so there's already kind of these points of friction, and I think there's real issues around the question of not just how patents are managed, for example, but how particular technologies as they are put forward can change the larger open source community and whether or not that brings enough value back. Like this is an active area of struggle, I would say, and how it's going to be resolved is not clear.
Thank you so much.
I'll just grab some of the questions. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.